November 7th, 2016. It's a Monday night in Jacksonville, Florida, the Sunshine State's biggest city.
Not only is it home to nearly 1 million people, but it also sprawls across 800 square miles.
Jacksonville in landmass area is the largest city in the United States.
But Jacksonville also has some very big problems.
Our homicide rate is out the roof. Jacksonville has some lovely parts and then some parts where some people just don't feel the safest.
It's a little after 10 o'clock that evening when a call comes in from one of those parts of town.
Jacksonville 911.
There's a man laying out here in the street.
Do you think he needs an ambulance?
I see him bleeding.
But the driver doesn't intend to stick around and offer help.
I'm not getting out of the car to see if he's okay.
She was worried about whether or not the person who had hurt them was still in the area.
Although when officers arrive at the scene a few minutes later, there's only the man.
They find a black male laying in a pool of blood. He has a gunshot wound to the head. He doesn't have a pulse.
How he'd ended up on the side of the road isn't entirely clear.
There were pieces of shattered glass right beside his body.
They were consistent with automotive safety glass.
So it was either a drive-by shooting or the murder had occurred somewhere else and the body was dropped there.
All the police know for sure is that the victim is 31-year-old Eddie Brown.
They looked in his pockets and they found his identification as well as the keys to a nearby hotel.
But that's all first responders could find.
Jacksonville native Eddie Brown made a name for himself as a young man.
He was a very accomplished athlete. He was a star on a high school basketball team that won the Florida State Championship.
He had a very promising athletic future. So he had these huge hoop dreams. He wanted to go to the NBA or play professionally.
But those dreams were dashed in an instant.
When he was in college, his nephew was killed, and then that caused him to come home. It was like a part of his life shut off.
It might have broken him if he hadn't met Serena Tenney soon after.
I was, I think, 20 when I met him. We was at a club. I was walking past him, and he said, "Excuse me."
That was all it took.
I looked at him, and then I double took, and the next thing you know, I just went to him.
Hey.
Sorry for bumping into you.
Don't be.
I remember giving him my number, and it went from there. It was like love at first sight. We was always having fun.
But it was the way that Eddie doted on her daughter from a previous relationship that sealed the deal.
It's like, yeah, he's the one.
Before long, Serena was pregnant with Eddie's child.
He was just so happy.
They soon had a second child as well.
You know how they say most people, when you have kids, they change? 9 times out of 10, it be for the worse? No. He was the dad that gave them whatever they wanted. They played to sun up to sundown. He was a family guy. It was fun.
And after 7 years together, Serena and Eddie decided to finally make things official.
He came up behind me in the kitchen, and when I turned around, he slowly went down.
What are you doing?
Will you marry me?
Oh my gosh.
When he asked me, my mouth just dropped. And I was like, oh my God, are you serious? And then I told him yes, and we laughed. I cried.
But now, just a few months after the engagement, first responders are scrambling to save Eddie's life.
He was discovered on the side of the road with a gunshot wound to the head.
He didn't have a pulse.
Despite that, the EMTs don't declare him dead at the scene.
They put him on a gurney and started chest compressions.
They do take him to the hospital.
By then, detectives are on the scene.
Pulled up on the body, got some blood over there. I pulled a wallet out of his pocket. Eddie Brown, he's got some priors.
When police ran Eddie's name through the database, they found he had a lengthy rap sheet.
This may have been drug-related.
After a tragedy ended his dreams of stardom, Eddie Brown found love and fulfillment with his fiancée, Serena Tenney.
Will you marry me?
They had hopes of a great future together.
But now, EMTs have rushed Eddie to the hospital, his life hanging in the balance.
He has a gunshot wound to the head. He was found discarded on the side of the road like trash.
Detectives suspect the shooting was drug-related.
He had some drug history in his past.
The crime scene also offers detectives some possible clues.
They did have the shattered glass that they saw around him.
It indicated that he was shot inside of a vehicle and pulled or pushed out of the vehicle.
Detectives also have the motel key card that first responders found in Eddie's pocket.
At that point, we went straight to the motel.
Talking to the hotel manager, they determined that he had been staying there for a few weeks.
Hi, good evening. Hey there.
Hoping it could reveal the shooter's identity, detectives also ask for copies of the motel security video.
I can put that on a thumb drive for you.
That would be great.
Right. We appreciate it.
After securing the footage, the detectives head to the hospital to check on the victim.
By then, Eddie's fiancée learned of the shooting.
It was 2:48 in the morning. I'm like, who is this? Can I speak to Eddie? She said, do Eddie have any living family? And I'm like, wow, what's going on? And she was like, I need you to contact his family and get to the hospital now.
Serena called Eddie's parents and then raced to the hospital.
When she gets there, the doctor is waiting.
Where's Eddie? Where's Eddie? I got a phone call. Where?
And they said, I'm sorry, Eddie didn't make it. And I just freaked out. I lost it.
Serena is still trying to pull herself together when the detectives arrive at the hospital.
Serena?
Yes.
Detective, I know this is tough.
I told her this case would not be a cold case, and I meant that.
She made it clear to investigators that he was a very important part of her life.
However, she also admits that Eddie was no angel.
Serena told police that he had been selling drugs to help with family expenses.
I told him I don't condone what you're doing.
Despite that, Eddie didn't stop.
It's fast, quick money, and it's hard to want to go back to a normal job and get a normal paycheck.
Still, Serena says she yearned for a normal life.
I said, that's not the life that I want for me or my kids.
That's why I called up the engagement and he moved out.
Which explained what he was doing at the motel.
Although according to Serena, Eddie had recently started having second thoughts.
He told me that he was gonna leave everything alone. He was like, I got stuff to take care of, but I'm gonna come home.
It kind of sounded like Eddie wanted to make one last big score before calling it quits.
Had it ended up costing Eddie his life?
And any idea who could have done this to him?
No.
Do you know any of the names of the guys he did business with?
No. I didn't want any part of it.
Thank you for your time.
Or is it possible Serena knew more about Eddie's death than she was letting on?
There was some discord in the relationship that may provide a motive.
Detectives hope the answer lies somewhere in the surveillance footage from Eddie's motel.
Yes, Scott.
As investigators scrub through the footage from the night Eddie died, they notice a white vehicle pull into a parking spot just before 10 p.m., just minutes before he was shot and killed.
On the video, a woman gets out of the SUV.
She walked up to Eddie Brown's motel room. He opened the door to let her in.
Serena was definitely not the woman that they had saw on the surveillance video.
Then, while Eddie and the mystery woman are inside his room, a man gets out of the same SUV and walks around the motel, out of sight.
You could tell something was going on because he didn't stay inside the vehicle.
A few minutes later, Eddie and the mystery woman leave his motel room and get into the SUV.
She got inside the front driver's seat, and Eddie Brown walked around to the front passenger seat.
Then, as the mystery woman is pulling out of the parking space, the man who'd gotten out of the car suddenly reappears.
She stopped, got out of the vehicle, gave him a hug as though she just saw him, even though they had pulled up to the motel room together. And he got inside of the back passenger seat, and then they drove away.
The 911 call reporting Eddie shot on the side of the road came in just a few minutes later.
The detectives suspected he died inside that white SUV.
But who were the mystery woman and her passenger?
It was impossible to make out the license plate on the surveillance video.
Hoping Eddie may have been in contact with a woman prior to their meetup, the detectives subpoena his phone records.
They discover he received a phone call shortly before he was found dead. Police then tracked that phone number to a person named Angel Hernandez.
When the detectives bring Angel in for questioning, he admits that he knows Eddie.
He knows him by the nickname of Brick, but he says he's not the one that called Brick from his phone that night.
According to Angel, at 9:30 p.m., a woman he only knows as Shayla knocked on his door.
He knew Shayla from the street. She would occasionally come over and ask to use his phone.
And according to Angel, Shayla had someone with her.
Can I borrow your phone?
Can you describe him best you can?
Black male, short hair, not stalking anything, average build.
There you go.
It sounded like the man from the video.
Angel says he'd let Shayla borrow his phone.
Eddie, we need to talk.
He couldn't hear everything that they were talking about.
But what he heard sounded urgent.
I get the sense that there was a worry.
In fact, it sounded like Eddie already knew what was going to happen.
Shayla, you're gonna get me killed.
Detectives investigating Eddie Brown's murder have a possible lead on the mystery woman who came to his motel room shortly before he was shot and dumped on the street a few blocks away.
His phone records that showed that the call he had received before he died was from a male that they hadn't been aware of before. His name was Angel.
But when police tracked down Angel, he swore he didn't make that call.
Hey, Shayla.
He says a woman named Shayla showed up at his door and asked if she could use his phone.
She made a phone call to the victim, Eddie Brown.
And according to Angel, it was a tense conversation.
I could hear through the earpiece Sim getting loud on the other side.
Angel said he overheard Eddie on the phone call say, "You're going to get me killed."
He said that to her?
Twice.
Obviously, there's a motive there that the investigators need to discover.
Could you tell whether she was trying to meet up with him later?
Definitely the conversation was to meet up.
When detectives show Angel images from the motel surveillance videos, it appears that is exactly what happened.
Angel confirms that the woman in the video is Shayla, and the man who got in the back seat is the man she was with.
But that's about all that Angel knew.
All right.
Appreciate you coming in.
With Angel unable to identify the woman further, the detectives turned back to Eddie's fiancée, Serena.
They showed me a picture.
She didn't recognize the man, but she knew the woman.
That's not her real name.
She said, "You sure that's not Shayla?" I said, "No. Her real name is Felicia." And she did dates off a Backpage and a little street walking.
She was also a customer of Eddie's.
She'll go do dates to bring back more money to Eddie just to get her high.
But rumor has it, Felicia would sometimes skip the middleman.
She would trade Eddie's sex for drugs.
She got drunk and she told me.
Serena admits that's what really caused the split between her and Eddie.
When she told me, I went in the house and I packed this stuff and I had to buy the front door.
That's the reason he was living in a motel. But recently he said...
But then, just before his murder, Eddie had told Serena he and Felicia were through.
He was like, "I just wanted to let you know I don't want nothing to do with her. I just want my family back."
If what Serena is telling them is true, did she just give Felicia a motive?
Police did wonder whether or not she may have been jealous of the fact that Eddie was going back to Serena.
5 days after the murder, detectives track Felicia down and start asking her questions about Eddie.
What about what happened earlier this week? That don't have nothing to do with that, man.
She told police that she had heard about his death on the news and that she was heartbroken.
And even though they were no longer involved, they were still good friends. They stayed in contact.
She also admits to seeing him the evening of the murder.
She wanted to buy some weed from him.
You want me to be honest, that's what I went for.
She tells detectives on the night of November 7th she borrowed a car from her friend named Pop.
Felicia says that Pop had also asked her to give a ride to a friend of his, a man she only knew as BT.
She did agree to give him a ride, but she told him that she had to run some errands first.
From Pop's place, they drove over to Angel Hernandez's house so that she could call Eddie. He told her to come by the hotel to buy some weed.
Then you went over there to the hotel? Yeah.
She said when she got to the motel, BT told her that he would just walk the rest of the way.
Only be a minute. Suit yourself.
Felicia says she'd left BT in the car and gone to Eddie's door.
But while she was inside, Eddie made her an offer.
You wanted me to take me to get something to eat.
But she says that as they were leaving, BT had suddenly reappeared.
What's up?
Walking.
I changed my mind, man.
She told him that was fine, but that Eddie wanted to take her out for dinner first.
So BT got back in the car and they all headed out to dinner.
But according to Felicia, they didn't get far.
She said while they were driving to the restaurant, BT then gets a call from Pop.
Hey, this Pop, he said you need a ride.
Yeah, we can
I went and pick him up over there somewhere off a highway.
And by the time they got Pop, she felt like it was too late to go out to eat.
Felicia says she then drove herself home and gave the keys to the SUV to Pop.
Pop then got behind the wheel and then the three men drove off together.
I didn't do anything.
According to Felicia, that's the last time she saw Eddie.
Last time I saw him, he was alive. Leaving.
And the conversation Angel overheard, the one where Eddie supposedly said Felicia was going to get him killed?
According to her, it never happened.
That's not the way anything went down.
And she swears she didn't have anything to do with Eddie's murder.
I'm not trying to be disrespectful. But for someone to even come at me like I did anything to him, no.
Detectives aren't quite ready to believe her. But before they lean on her any harder, they want to track down the man she knows only as BT.
It seemed likely that he had something to do with Eddie's death.
But before they can begin searching for him, they get a call from Angel Hernandez.
He told them that he had heard some talk from the streets.
He let them know Felicia had allegedly lent Eddie $500.
The problem is she didn't have $500 to lend.
500?
She had stolen that $500 from her sugar daddy, a drug dealer by the name of Millie.
Was that why Eddie said she was going to get him killed?
Informant Angel Hernandez has contacted detectives investigating Eddie Brown's murder with a lead on the possible motive behind the crime.
Felicia had allegedly lent Eddie $500.
The problem is she didn't have $500 to lend. She had stolen the $500 from a local drug dealer named Millie, or as she liked to call him, her sugar daddy.
Could that explain how Eddie ended up dead on the side of the road?
Allegedly, when Millie found out she had stolen the money, he became furious.
This is word on the streets, you know what I'm saying?
It would not be uncommon for a drug dealer to react to somebody that owed him money with violence.
Detectives immediately haul Millie in for an interview.
Need to ask you a few questions. They make it clear that they're not there to discuss his drug activity.
They assure him they just want to talk to you about Eddie's homicide.
He denied knowing anything about the murder.
But he doesn't deny everything.
Millie said, "Oh, I knew about the $500.
Okay, so that money is yours.
He confirms to police that she did steal $500 from him.
I'm just guessing here. Maybe you wanted him dead because you guys had a beef.
But he denies any involvement in the murder, and he denies having any issue with Eddie.
I mean, I'm not with no beef and no.
All he wanted was his money.
Millie says he told her she better pay him back and she better do it soon.
Was that why Felicia had gone to see Eddie that night?
She had the motivation to recover that money no matter what.
In addition to a possible motive, Millie also knew Lisa's likely accomplice.
BT is 26-year-old Blair Terry, and Pop's real name is Jason Stevens.
He also provides police with the address of where they can find Jason Stevens.
They call it a trap house, and he told me exactly where it was located.
Is he telling the truth about any of it?
He knows the more helpful I am towards them, the less they're going to focus on me as a suspect.
The detectives weren't entirely sure that Millie was telling them everything that he knew.
But at the end of the interview, they have no choice but to let him go.
We didn't have anything to hold him on.
Then they follow up on his tip on where to find Jason.
We drive by that house numerous times, and we found a white SUV on the side of the road.
It was a match for the SUV in the motel video.
So I thought, wow, this is it. This has got to be the car.
Closer examination all but confirms it.
Look at this.
The passenger side window has recently been replaced, and the workmanship was very shoddy.
There's broken glass all over the seat.
They call out their crime scene investigators to come and do a full forensic investigation.
Let's go talk to him.
Yeah.
Then the detectives locate Jason inside the house and bring him in for questioning.
He did admit to the fact he loaned the vehicle out to Felisa Lopano.
You regularly let people use that vehicle?
Yes.
Okay, in exchange for money?
Mm-hmm.
She paid him $100 to borrow the vehicle.
Okay, who was with her?
BT.
But that's where the similarities in Felicia and Jason's stories end.
Jason denied that he ever called BT to come pick him up.
He says he was at home the whole night.
He says he hadn't seen them from the time they picked up his car until the following morning.
When she gave you back the keys, did anything seem off or strange about her or the way she was acting?
No, not really.
But Jason says that when he went to drive the car an hour or so later, he was in for a shock.
The passenger side door window was shattered.
Broken out completely?
Completely.
They didn't tell him about it. They just dropped the car off.
Jason said he was furious. He wanted to know what happened to his car.
Jason says he'd reached out to BT for an explanation.
He gave me the answer that he was either him or me.
What are you even talking about?
I asked him, who is him?
Brick, man. It was Brick.
Brick was Eddie's street name that he was known by as a drug dealer.
According to Jason Stevens, a man named Blair Terry had all but confessed to the murder of Eddie Brown.
He basically stated it was either him or me.
Which suggested that Blair was the one who shot Eddie.
As he's telling you these things, are you asking any more questions?
No, not really. Now I don't even want to know no more.
BT did at least agree to pay for the window he shot out of Jason's SUV.
So he called a glass company, had the window repaired.
For the moment, detectives aren't sure that Jason is telling them the whole truth.
Felisa said that Jason called them later that night, asking them to pick him up, which he denies.
But as soon as CSI start examining Jason's SUV, there is little doubt they've uncovered the crime scene.
When you open the door, you can hear the glass inside the door frame. You could hear the glass shake.
Inside, other than a few scattered shards of glass, the car appears relatively clean.
But once we process the vehicle with the black light stuff, you can see there was blood all over that front seat. And the seat belt.
In the back seat, the detectives find more evidence of the shooting.
We found a .40 caliber shell casing underneath the floor mat in the back seat.
Which would be consistent with where BT was sitting on the video.
That was also consistent with Jason's story.
This solidifies the direction of their investigation and seriously looking at BT as the person who pulled the trigger.
Then, after sending blood samples from the SUV to the crime lab for testing, detectives bring Blair Terry in for questioning.
They started by getting him to admit that he knows Shayla.
Everybody around knew the white girl with the red hair as Shayla. How long have you known her?
I've known her from just like the spurts you see in the hair, see in the hair.
Then the detectives move on to the night of November 7th, the night of Eddie's murder.
He tells them they had been hanging out at a friend's place.
You don't live there though, right? You just hang out there, or you just happen to be
No, I
there?
just happen to just be there actually.
She mentioned she was going to borrow the car, so he asked her if she could give him a ride.
BT says that Felicia borrowed Jason's SUV and gave him a lift, but she made a few stops along the way.
The first stop was this guy's house that he didn't know. She told him that she needed to make a phone call.
This, of course, was that phone call that Angel Hernandez overheard.
She was telling him something like I was talking to him.
Yeah. What was she talking about?
I don't know. I wasn't focused on their conversation.
From there, they drove to a motel and she told him to wait in the car while she went inside to talk to someone.
I'll only be a minute.
BT says he sat in the car for a while, but he eventually grew impatient.
She was taking forever, and I'm like, well, okay, what's going on? So I got out of the car.
He wandered around the parking lot for a bit until he saw Felicia driving off.
This was all confirmed by the surveillance video.
When you got back in the car, there was another guy sitting in the front seat.
Yeah, that kind of freaked me out. I ain't know where Eddie was.
Yeah, who'd she say it was?
I don't know. She was like, this ex. She didn't say no name.
He said that he never knew Eddie's name.
In fact, he claims they were only in the car together for a few minutes.
He claimed that he was dropped off at a local gas station.
Blair Terry said that he was dropped off while the victim was still sitting in the front seat.
And Felicia's claim that they made a detour to pick up Jason Stevens, aka Pop.
I don't even know Pop being around.
He says Pop was never with them in the car.
So you don't know anything about the window. She never mentioned anything to you about anything happening in that car?
No, ma'am.
He said he didn't know what the detectives were talking about.
Okay, well, someone was shot and killed in that. Someone was shot and killed.
What?
Yeah. Someone was shot and killed in that car.
That's why I'm here.
At that point, BT decides to stop the interview.
I want to talk to a lawyer or something like that because I don't know what's going on right now.
That's what Blair Terry claims. But when the detectives follow up on his alibi, they find reason to doubt him.
They went to that gas station and looked for the surveillance.
Nowhere that evening at all was there any evidence of the white car or of BT being anywhere near that gas station.
It's proof that Blair was lying to them.
But it takes the test results from Pop's SUV to provide definite proof of where the murder occurred.
The DNA came back from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Biology Department, and that blood was a perfect match to the blood of Eddie Brown.
Once the test results are in, the detectives take both Felicia and Blair Terry into custody.
They had a probable cause to arrest both of them for the murder.
It's news Eddie's fiancée has been waiting to hear for weeks.
The lead detective called me January 15th, 2017. She said, Miss Tenney? I said, yes, ma'am. She said they was arrested for second-degree murder. I was happy. I was overjoyed.
But will her happiness prove premature?
The next challenge is going to be proving who pulled the trigger.
I don't want to hear another word from you.
Police have placed both Felicia Lapano and Blair Terry under arrest for the murder of Eddie Brown.
While both were charged with murder, detectives are convinced that Blair Terry pulled the trigger.
The full autopsy on Eddie Brown's body determines that the shot was fired from behind and to the left of the victim,
which was consistent with where BT was seated in the video just prior to the murder.
Will it be enough to convince a jury?
One of the first tactics they're going to use is to point the fingers at each other to try to create reasonable doubt.
Unsure they can secure a conviction, the prosecutors approach Felicia's lawyers with an offer.
She will be allowed to plead guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree murder.
We needed her testimony to nail Blair Terry as the shooter.
But when it comes to sentencing, there's no guarantee.
In return for her testimony, her sentencing would be delayed until after BT's trial.
The prosecutors may have turned Felicia against him, but Blair Terry appears confident when he goes on trial for Eddie's murder.
It was intense. When he come out, we're already sitting out there, and he would just stare me in my face with a smirk on his face.
According to the prosecution, it was the look of a killer.
The prosecutors paint a picture, and they were able to weave all the elements together. BT's background and his criminal history and his violence.
Then, to make the picture complete, the prosecutors put Felicia on the stand.
She testified in the murder trial about what happened that evening. Felicia Lapano made that phone call to Eddie Brown's phone, and moments later, she pulls up to the motel with Blair Terry.
She says she went to the motel to see Eddie to try to get back the money. And she took Blair Terry as backup just in case Eddie didn't want to pay her back.
Felicia says she and Eddie talked things out in the motel room.
Eddie, you gotta give me that money back.
You should have told me it was Millie's money.
That's why Eddie said to her, "You're going to get me killed."
It doesn't matter. You can get the money, right?
I guess. It'll take a minute, though.
Then they'd left Eddie's motel room to get something to eat.
But in the car, she and Eddie started to argue.
I can't believe you did this to me! I'm sorry!
Bro, don't talk to her like that.
Blair took exception to the way Eddie was talking to her.
But according to Felicia's testimony, what Blair did next caught her totally by surprise.
Blair Terry ended up shooting him in the back of the head.
What'd you do that for?
She said she had no idea what Blair Terry was going to do to Eddie Brown, and she did not know that Blair Terry had a handgun.
She said she just wanted to get her $500 back.
Instead, they now had to try to cover up a murder.
BT told her to pull the car over. She pulled the car over. He got out of the car, pulled Eddie's body out of the front passenger seat, laid it by the side of the road, got back in the car, and they left.
When it's the defense's turn, Blair Terry's attorneys maintain that he wasn't in the car when Eddie was shot.
Blair's defense was, just like he told the investigators, hey, I just got a ride from this lady. They dropped me off. I have no idea how it happened.
Those claims carry little weight with the jury.
Blair Terry is found guilty of murder. He is sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The life sentence without parole would be appropriate for that sort of senseless violence.
Eddie's fiance doesn't see it that way.
I didn't call it justice because it didn't bring him back. But to know that because you took someone's life and you would never be able to live your life the way you want to, it gave me a little bit of peace.
But while Serena feels that Blair Terry's sentence falls short of justice, she believes Felicia's is an outrage.
She was sentenced to a 13-year prison term for second-degree murder.
I was livid about a 13-year sentence. That's not enough.
The reality is that people who cooperate and help the state get a conviction will get the benefit of helping the state get that conviction.
But that still leaves Eddie's family to deal with the aftermath of his untimely death.
He didn't deserve this. There's nothing in this case that would justify pulling the trigger and having Eddie Brown murdered.
As a victim of a violent crime, it didn't just impact him, it impacted all those people that cared about him. And he was a family man. He had people in his life that loved him.
It's just a heartbreaking situation for his fiance and his kids. He had young children that won't really remember him.
Although for his fiancée, Serena, their children do give her a little piece of Eddie to hold on to.
He's not here physically, but I feel him when it comes through my kids. And at times it's like I get frustrated, but then I remember, okay, maybe this is his way of telling me it's gonna be okay. Everything is gonna be okay. Just do what you gotta do. Hold on, keep going, keep fighting, and take it a day at a time. It's tough, but he's watching.
On a warm evening in Arizona, when the desert sun was slowly sinking behind the horizon and the streets of Scottsdale were beginning to settle into the quiet rhythm of the night, a man stepped out of his office believing he was simply going home. His name was Dr. Stephen Pitt. For more than 2 decades, Stephen Pitt had spent his life walking into the darkest corners of the human mind. He studied the thoughts of people accused of unimaginable crimes. He sat across from murderers, violent offenders, and individuals whose actions had left families shattered forever. He listened to their words, examined their behavior, and tried to answer questions that most people were afraid to even ask. Why does someone kill? How does a person cross the invisible line between anger and violence? What happens inside a mind when hatred becomes stronger than reason? These were not just academic questions for Stephen Pitt. They were the foundation of his career. He was the kind of expert called when a case became too complex, when investigators needed someone who could look beyond the crime scene and into the psychology of the person responsible. His professional reputation had taken him into some of America's most infamous investigations. He had been connected to cases that captured national attention, cases where the public demanded answers, and where every decision carried enormous consequences. But on May 31, 2018, the man who spent his career analyzing dangerous people suddenly became the target of one. It was a Thursday afternoon in Arizona. The day appeared ordinary. The streets around his office were filled with the usual movement of a city preparing for evening. Cars passed by. People continued with their routines. Employees finished their workday. Nothing suggested that something terrible was about to happen. Inside his office, Stephen Pitt had been doing what he had done countless times before, working with information, reports, and human stories filled with pain and conflict. He had spent years helping courts understand people accused of violence. He had examined the behavior of criminals and provided professional opinions that could influence the direction of trials. His evaluations could determine whether someone was considered mentally responsible for their actions, whether they posed a danger to society, or whether treatment was necessary. That responsibility made him respected. But it also meant that, over the years, he had crossed paths with many people who were unhappy with his conclusions. Some defendants hated him. Some families disagreed with him. Some people believed his professional opinions had changed the course of their lives forever. For someone like Stephen Pitt, the possibility of anger from others was always present. It was a risk that came with the profession. But nothing prepared anyone for what happened next. Around 5:20 in the afternoon, Stephen Pitt left his office and walked toward his vehicle. He was not walking into a courtroom. He was not sitting across from a dangerous offender. He was simply leaving work. Then, according to investigators, a confrontation occurred. A few words were exchanged. A brief argument broke the normal flow of the evening. And within moments, gunfire shattered the quiet. The attack was sudden and deliberate. Stephen Pitt collapsed outside his office as the person responsible quickly escaped from the scene. For those nearby, the moment was impossible to understand. 1 second, there was a normal afternoon outside a professional building. The next, a respected doctor, who had spent his life studying violence, became another victim of it. When police arrived, they immediately recognized something disturbing. This was not a random act. Nothing had been stolen. There was no obvious attempt at robbery. The attacker appeared to have known exactly who he was looking for. The question was not simply, who killed Stephen Pitt? The deeper question was, who hated him enough to plan his death? At first, investigators faced a difficult puzzle. Stephen Pitt's career created countless possibilities. He had worked around some of the most dangerous individuals in the country. He had studied criminals. He had provided expert testimony. He had been involved in investigations where emotions ran extremely high. Detectives considered several theories. Could this have been revenge from someone connected to an old case? Could someone who disagreed with his professional conclusions have decided to punish him? Could a former patient, or someone connected to a criminal investigation, have targeted him? The list of possibilities was long. But before investigators could find answers, the case became something far more terrifying. Because Stephen Pitt was not the only target. Less than 24 hours after his death, another violent attack occurred. This time, the location was a law office in Scottsdale. Inside were people who had no idea they were about to become part of a deadly plan. Two women, Valeria Sharp and Laura Anderson, worked as legal assistants. They were not public figures. They were not investigators. They were simply employees who arrived at work, completed their daily responsibilities, and expected to return home at the end of the day. But someone had decided they belonged on a list. They were shot and killed. The connection between the attacks immediately changed everything. Police realized they were not investigating a single murder. They were searching for someone who was moving through Arizona with a purpose. Someone who had chosen targets carefully. Someone who seemed to be following a plan. The fear spread quickly. Because when a killer attacks once, investigators search for motives. But when a killer attacks again, they begin searching for patterns. And patterns reveal intention. The question haunting detectives became: who was next? Behind the scenes, investigators began looking deeper into Stephen Pitt's past. They examined his professional relationships, his previous cases, and the people who had interacted with him throughout his career. Slowly, a disturbing possibility began to emerge. This was not about his famous cases. It was about something much more personal. A conflict that had started years earlier. A conflict that had never truly ended. Nearly a decade before the shootings, a man named Dwight Lamont Jones had been involved in a painful and complicated divorce. During that legal battle, Stephen Pitt had been brought in to evaluate Jones and assess his behavior. The evaluation would become a turning point. Pitt's professional conclusions painted a picture of a man struggling with anger, resentment, and a potential risk of escalating violence. For most people, an evaluation is simply a document. For someone who feels betrayed or humiliated, it can become something else entirely. A symbol. A reminder of everything they believe was taken from them. And over the years, according to investigators, Dwight Jones developed a deep resentment toward the people he believed were responsible for destroying his life. He did not see them as professionals doing their jobs. He saw them as enemies. In his mind, they were connected. The doctor. The lawyers. The people who worked around them. All of them became part of the same story he had created inside his own mind. A story where he was the victim. A story where revenge became the only answer. By the time investigators discovered this connection, the violence had already begun. A man who had spent years feeling wronged had transformed his anger into action. And now, police were racing against time to stop him before the list was complete. The tragedy of Stephen Pitt's murder was not only that a brilliant professional had been killed. It was that the person who spent his life trying to understand violence had become trapped in someone else's desire for revenge. He had studied the minds of killers. He had explained their behavior to judges and juries. He had helped society understand the warning signs. But on that evening in Arizona, understanding violence was no longer enough. Because this time, violence had found him. And the investigation that followed would uncover a story of obsession, resentment, and a decade-long desire for revenge that ended in one of Arizona's most shocking crime sprees. A story where the warning signs existed for years. A story where one man's anger grew quietly in the shadows. And a story that would force an entire community to confront a frightening question. How long can hatred survive before it finally explodes? Scottsdale, Arizona, was a city built on contrasts. To many people, it represented beauty, wealth, and tranquility. It was a place of bright skies, luxury neighborhoods, elegant restaurants, and streets lined with palm trees standing against the endless desert landscape. Visitors came for the resorts, the golf courses, and the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to define the region. But beneath that calm exterior was a city just like any other place in America, a place where personal struggles, broken relationships, and hidden conflicts existed behind closed doors. In the spring of 2018, Scottsdale moved at its usual pace. The temperatures were rising as summer approached. The desert heat was becoming more intense each day, covering the city in a familiar blanket of dry warmth. During the afternoon, sunlight reflected off buildings and vehicles, creating the shimmering appearance that Arizona was famous for. For many residents, May 31st was simply another day. People went to work. Families made plans for the evening. Employees watched the clock as the end of the workday approached. No one knew that within hours, the name Stephen Pitt would become connected to a crime that would shock the entire state. The building where Dr. Stephen Pitt worked was not a place that attracted attention. It was not a courthouse surrounded by cameras. It was not a police facility protected by security. It was simply a professional office where people came seeking answers, evaluations, and expert opinions. But inside those walls, some of the most complicated human stories were examined. Stephen Pitt's work placed him in a unique position. He lived between two worlds. One world was the world of medicine, science, and psychology, a world built around understanding human behavior. The other was the world of crime, violence, and tragedy, a world where emotions often reached their most extreme levels. Few professionals spent as much time studying the reasons people hurt others. Throughout his career, Pitt had looked into the minds of individuals accused of terrible acts. He analyzed their backgrounds, their personalities, their emotional states, and their decision-making processes. He tried to separate emotion from evidence, fear from facts, assumptions from reality. His job required patience and discipline because human behavior was rarely simple. A person who committed a violent act was not always easy to understand. Sometimes there were years of trauma, mental illness, resentment, or personal failure hidden beneath the surface. Other times, there were patterns of manipulation and aggression that had been developing for years. Stephen Pitt's role was to examine those details and provide an expert perspective. But that responsibility came with a hidden danger. When a professional gives an opinion about someone, especially in a legal setting, that opinion can change the course of a person's future. A defendant could receive treatment instead of punishment. A court could decide someone was dangerous. A family could hear information they never wanted to accept. For many people, those conclusions were simply part of the justice system. But for others, especially those who already felt betrayed by the world around them, those conclusions could become personal. And that was the danger Stephen Pitt faced. Not because he had done something wrong, but because he worked in a field where people sometimes blamed the messenger. Years before the shooting, Stephen Pitt became involved in the life of Dwight Lamont Jones. At the time, Jones was not known nationally. He was not a name that appeared in headlines. He was simply a man going through a painful personal crisis. A marriage had collapsed. Legal battles had begun. Emotions had intensified. And like many divorces involving conflict, there were disagreements over what happened, who was responsible, and what the future would look like. But this divorce would become different. Because for Dwight Jones, the conflict did not end when the legal process ended. Instead, according to investigators, it followed him. It remained in his thoughts. It became part of how he viewed his life. The events of 2009 would eventually become the foundation of a violent revenge plan nearly a decade later. At the center of that history was a psychological evaluation. Stephen Pitt was asked to assess Jones during the divorce proceedings. The purpose was not punishment. It was not an attack. It was a professional assessment designed to help understand Jones's behavior and potential risks. But the conclusions were not what Jones wanted to hear. Pitt's evaluation reportedly raised concerns about Jones's emotional state and potential for future violence. For someone already experiencing anger and frustration, such an evaluation could feel like another door closing. Instead of seeing it as an expert opinion, Jones appeared to interpret it as an act of betrayal. Over time, that belief became stronger. The people involved in the divorce became connected in his mind. The lawyers, the professionals, the people who assisted them, and eventually, Stephen Pitt. Years passed. Life continued for everyone else. Stephen Pitt continued his career. The legal professionals involved moved forward. The world outside changed. But investigators later believed that Dwight Jones remained trapped in the past. The anger did not disappear. It grew. And when anger is repeatedly fed by resentment, it can transform into something much more dangerous. A person may begin rewriting their own history. They may stop seeing events as complicated situations involving multiple perspectives. Instead, they create a simple story. There are victims. There are enemies. There is someone to blame. And there is a reason for revenge. This psychological transformation would become one of the most important elements investigators examined after the shootings. Because the question was not only why Dwight Jones killed. The question was how he reached a point where killing seemed acceptable. How did a man carry resentment for almost 10 years? How did frustration become obsession? How did a memory of a painful period in his life become a plan involving multiple deaths? Those questions would haunt investigators as they reconstructed the final days of the victims. But before the investigation could reveal the killer, the victims deserved to be understood. Because behind every headline, every police report, and every courtroom statement, there were real people. Stephen Pitt was not just a famous forensic psychiatrist. He was a husband, a colleague, a mentor, and a person whose entire life had been dedicated to helping others. He had spent decades trying to bring clarity to situations filled with confusion. He had helped families understand painful truths. He had helped courts make difficult decisions. He had entered the darkest parts of human behavior not because he wanted attention, but because he believed understanding could prevent future tragedies. His work placed him close to danger, but he never imagined that one day he would become part of the very violence he spent his career analyzing. The tragedy of Stephen Pitt's death was made even more disturbing by the irony. A man who studied warning signs became the victim of someone whose anger had been building silently. A man who understood criminal behavior became the target of someone who believed he was seeking justice. And a professional who spent his life examining the minds of others would eventually become the subject of a national investigation. As investigators would soon discover, the murder outside his office was not the end of a story. It was the beginning. Because somewhere in Arizona, a man who had already decided who was responsible for his suffering was still moving. And the names on his list had not all been reached yet. Before he became a name in a police investigation, before his photograph appeared across television screens, and before the world learned that a respected forensic psychiatrist had been murdered outside his own office, Stephen Pitt was simply a man who dedicated his life to understanding people. He was not someone who searched for attention. He was not someone who wanted fame. His work placed him in the spotlight, because the cases he touched were often among the most disturbing crimes in America. But behind the professional reputation was a person who had spent decades trying to answer one of humanity's most difficult questions. What causes a person to lose control and commit an act of violence? Stephen Pitt was born in 1959 and grew up with an interest in medicine and human behavior. From an early stage, he was fascinated by the complexity of the human mind. Unlike many medical professionals who focused only on physical illness, Pitt was drawn to the invisible battles happening inside people's thoughts, emotions, and memories. The brain could be examined. The body could be treated. But the human mind remained one of the greatest mysteries. And for Pitt, understanding that mystery became a lifelong mission. As he developed his career in psychiatry, he eventually found himself specializing in forensic psychiatry, a field that exists at the intersection of mental health and the justice system. It was a demanding profession. A forensic psychiatrist does not simply diagnose mental health conditions. They are often asked to evaluate people accused of crimes and provide opinions that can have enormous consequences. They may have to determine whether someone understands right from wrong. They may have to assess whether an individual poses a danger to society. They may have to explain complicated psychological issues to judges and juries who are trying to make decisions that can change lives forever. For Stephen Pitt, this responsibility was not something he took lightly. He understood that behind every criminal case were human beings. There were victims who deserved justice. There were families searching for answers. And there were accused individuals whose minds needed to be examined carefully rather than judged only through emotion. That balance became the foundation of his professional identity. Over more than 25 years, Pitt became one of Arizona's most recognized forensic psychiatric experts. His reputation grew because of his ability to analyze complicated cases and explain psychological issues in a way that others could understand. He became someone investigators turned to when they needed insight into behavior. Someone attorneys called when a case involved questions about mental state. Someone courts trusted when they needed professional analysis. His career eventually connected him to some of America's most infamous criminal investigations. One of those cases was the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. The death of the 6-year-old girl in Colorado became one of the most heavily followed investigations in modern American history. Millions of people wanted answers. The media followed every development. The public debated theories for years. Stephen Pitt became involved as a psychological expert, examining aspects of the case and contributing his professional perspective. For many people, that case alone would have defined a career. But for Pitt, it was only one chapter. He also contributed to discussions surrounding the Columbine High School massacre, one of the most shocking acts of school violence in American history. The 1999 attack left the country struggling to understand how two teenagers could plan and carry out such a devastating massacre. Investigators searched for warning signs. They examined backgrounds, behavior, communication, and psychological factors. Experts like Pitt were part of a larger effort to understand what had happened and whether future tragedies could be prevented. He also assisted law enforcement in cases involving violent offenders, including investigations connected to the Baseline Killer, a serial offender who terrorized the Phoenix area. These cases brought Pitt into contact with the darkest examples of human behavior. He studied people who had caused unimaginable suffering. He listened to explanations that were difficult to hear. He analyzed patterns of manipulation, aggression, and obsession. But despite being surrounded by stories of violence, those stories did not define him. People who worked with Stephen Pitt often described him as professional, dedicated, and deeply committed to his work. He was not fascinated by criminals in the way entertainment sometimes portrays investigators. He was fascinated by understanding. There was a difference. To him, studying violent offenders was not about the criminals themselves. It was about learning why violence happens and finding ways to reduce the chances of it happening again. Outside of his career, Pitt was also a person with relationships, memories, and ordinary moments that had nothing to do with crime scenes or courtrooms. He was someone who could leave the intensity of his professional world behind and return to everyday life. The public often sees experts only through their work. They see the television interviews. They see the courtroom appearances. They see the professional titles. But they do not always see the person. They do not see the hours spent preparing reports late at night. They do not see the conversations with colleagues. They do not see the personal sacrifices required to work in such a demanding field. Stephen Pitt lived much of his life carrying the emotional weight of other people's tragedies. He examined cases where families had lost loved ones. He listened to stories of abuse, violence, and trauma. He walked through psychological landscapes filled with pain. Yet he continued because he believed his work mattered. That belief was one of the reasons his death shocked so many people. Because the man who spent his career helping others understand danger was eventually killed by someone who had transformed personal resentment into violence. The irony was impossible to ignore. Stephen Pitt knew that anger could grow. He knew that obsession could become dangerous. He knew that some people struggled to accept responsibility for their own actions. His professional life was built around recognizing those patterns. But no amount of knowledge could protect him from every threat. Especially when the danger came from someone who had spent years quietly building resentment. The conflict between Stephen Pitt and Dwight Lamont Jones had started almost a decade before the shooting. At the time, Pitt was not trying to harm Jones. He was performing his professional duty. He was evaluating a man during a difficult legal dispute and providing an expert opinion. But in Jones's mind, according to investigators, that evaluation became something much more personal. It became a symbol of everything he believed had gone wrong in his life. This is where the tragedy becomes more complicated. Because Stephen Pitt was not killed because of something he did that day. He was killed because someone had spent years holding on to a version of the past where Pitt represented blame. In reality, Pitt had been doing his job. But inside another person's mind, that professional decision had become a source of hatred. The man who spent his career studying perception and reality became a victim of someone else's distorted perception. When Stephen Pitt walked toward his car on May 31, 2018, he carried with him decades of experience, knowledge, and service. He had helped investigate some of America's most disturbing crimes. He had tried to bring understanding to situations filled with fear. He had dedicated his life to studying why people hurt others. But he never expected that one day, his own life would end because someone decided that revenge was more important than forgiveness. The story of Stephen Pitt is not only a story about a murder. It is the story of a man whose life was defined by trying to understand humanity at its worst while still believing in the possibility of something better. And that is what made his death so devastating. A person who spent years searching for answers became the victim of a question that investigators would now have to answer. What happens when someone's anger becomes stronger than their ability to let go? May 31, 2018, began like any other day in Arizona. The morning sun had already climbed high above the desert landscape, spreading intense heat across the streets of Scottsdale and Phoenix. The air carried the familiar dryness of early summer, and the city moved through its usual routine. People drove to work, businesses opened their doors, and offices across the area filled with employees focused on their daily responsibilities. Nothing about that day suggested that something unforgettable was about to happen. For Dr. Stephen Pitt, it was another workday. Another day spent inside the world he had known for decades. A world of psychological evaluations, legal documents, and difficult conversations. A world where he tried to understand people who had reached moments of extreme behavior. For years, Stephen Pitt had walked into rooms where others felt fear. He had sat across from individuals accused of serious crimes. He had listened to explanations, excuses, anger, and denial. He had studied the small details that could reveal what was happening beneath the surface. A change in tone. A contradiction in a story. A pattern of thinking. A hidden resentment. Those details were the foundation of his career. But on this particular afternoon, the danger was not inside an interview room. It was waiting outside. As the workday approached its end, the atmosphere around Stephen Pitt's office remained normal. Employees continued finishing their tasks. People moved in and out of nearby buildings. Vehicles passed through the streets. It was the kind of environment where people rarely imagine violence happening. Especially not against someone like Stephen Pitt. He was not a celebrity walking through a crowd. He was not a politician surrounded by security. He was a professional leaving his workplace. At approximately 5:20 in the afternoon, Stephen Pitt stepped outside. The details of his final moments would later become part of a careful police investigation. Investigators would reconstruct his movements. They would examine surveillance footage. They would speak with witnesses. They would try to understand what happened in those brief moments before his death. According to investigators, Pitt encountered the person who had been waiting for him. The meeting was not accidental. The attacker knew where Pitt worked. The attacker knew when he would likely leave. The attacker came prepared. For a brief moment, there was an exchange between the two men. Witnesses later described hearing a confrontation. Words were exchanged. The situation escalated quickly. And then the sound of gunfire changed everything. The attack was sudden, violent, and over within moments. Stephen Pitt, the man who had spent his entire career examining the causes of violence, was struck down by it. People nearby were left frozen. Some did not immediately understand what had happened. Others reacted instinctively, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding in front of them. A respected doctor was lying outside his office. A place associated with professionalism and safety had become the location of a deadly attack. The person responsible was already leaving. There was no dramatic confrontation. No long pursuit. No opportunity for anyone nearby to stop what had happened. The attacker escaped before authorities could arrive. But the questions began immediately. Why Stephen Pitt? Why here? Why now? When police arrived at the scene, they quickly recognized the nature of the crime. This was not a random shooting. The circumstances pointed toward a planned attack. The location suggested the victim had been targeted. The timing suggested the attacker had information about Pitt's routine. And the absence of robbery or theft indicated that the motive was likely personal. Someone had not come to take something from Stephen Pitt. Someone had come for Stephen Pitt himself. Investigators began collecting evidence. They examined the area around the office. They interviewed witnesses. They searched for surveillance footage from nearby buildings and businesses. Every detail mattered. A vehicle seen leaving the area. A description of the suspect. The direction the attacker traveled. Any conversation heard before the shooting. In cases like this, investigators know that the first hours are critical. A suspect who feels safe may make mistakes. Evidence may disappear. Witness memories may become less clear. Time becomes the enemy. But this investigation carried another unusual challenge. The victim himself. Stephen Pitt's background created a massive number of possible motives. Detectives knew they were not investigating an ordinary professional. They were investigating a man whose career had placed him in the middle of countless controversial and emotional situations. Throughout his years as a forensic psychiatrist, Pitt had evaluated people accused of serious crimes. He had offered opinions that some people accepted and others rejected. He had been involved in cases where families experienced unimaginable pain. He had been part of discussions involving guilt, responsibility, mental illness, and punishment. That history meant investigators had to consider possibilities that would not exist in many other murder cases. Could someone from his professional past have wanted revenge? Could someone blame him for an outcome they hated? Could a person connected to an old case have carried anger for years? At first, every possibility seemed possible. The investigation expanded in multiple directions. Detectives reviewed Pitt's professional relationships. They examined previous cases. They looked for anyone who had expressed hostility toward him. But what they did not yet know was that the answer was not hidden in a famous criminal case. It was hidden in a personal conflict from years earlier. A conflict involving divorce, accusations, and a man who believed others had destroyed his life. However, before that connection became clear, the community had another reason to fear. Because the murder of Stephen Pitt was not the final act. It was the opening move. The following day, while investigators were still working to understand why a respected psychiatrist had been killed, another violent attack occurred. This time, the victims were not famous experts. They were two women working inside a Scottsdale law office. Valeria Sharp and Laura Anderson. Their deaths transformed the case completely. A single murder can sometimes be an isolated tragedy. But two connected attacks create a pattern. And patterns reveal the presence of planning. The police were no longer searching only for the person who killed Stephen Pitt. They were searching for someone who had started a mission. Someone who was selecting targets. Someone who believed those targets deserved to die. The attack on Stephen Pitt became the first chapter of a terrifying chain of events that would unfold across Arizona. And as detectives began connecting the pieces, they would uncover a disturbing reality. The killer had not acted out of sudden rage. This was not a moment of uncontrolled anger. It was something that had been building. A belief. A grievance. A personal war that existed mostly inside one man's mind. For nearly 10 years, Dwight Lamont Jones had carried resentment connected to the painful collapse of his marriage and the people he believed were responsible. Stephen Pitt's evaluation had become, in Jones's mind, a symbol of betrayal. The lawyers involved became symbols. The people connected to that chapter of his life became symbols. And eventually, those symbols became targets. But on the afternoon of May 31st, no one knew the full extent of what was coming. No one knew that the shooting outside Stephen Pitt's office would become the beginning of one of Arizona's most disturbing crime sprees. No one knew that more victims would soon be added. No one knew that investigators were racing against a clock they could not see. Because the most dangerous part of a revenge plan is not always the first attack. It is what comes after. And for the people of Arizona, the next few days would reveal just how far one man was willing to go to punish those he believed had wronged him. When police officers arrived outside Dr. Stephen Pitt's office on the evening of May 31, 2018, they were stepping into a crime scene that seemed impossible to understand. The location was not a dark alley. It was not an abandoned building. It was not a place where people expected violence. It was a professional environment where, only minutes earlier, people had been finishing their workday and preparing to leave. Now, the area had been transformed. A place associated with routine and normal life had become the center of a homicide investigation. The first officers on scene were immediately confronted with the reality of what had happened. Stephen Pitt was dead. A man known throughout Arizona's legal and medical communities as an expert in understanding violent behavior had become the victim of a violent act himself. For investigators, the first challenge was preserving the scene. Every detail mattered. A footprint. A shell casing. A witness statement. A piece of surveillance footage. A vehicle seen leaving the area. In a murder investigation, especially one involving a targeted attack, the smallest pieces of evidence can become the foundation of the entire case. Detectives began working through the basic questions. Who was responsible? How did the attacker know where Pitt would be? Was this planned? Was someone watching him? And most importantly, why? The answer to that final question was the most difficult. Because Stephen Pitt was not an ordinary victim. He had spent years involved in cases where emotions ran high. His professional history meant that investigators could not immediately dismiss any possibility. A person angry about an old criminal case. Someone who disagreed with his testimony. A former subject of a psychological evaluation. A family member of someone affected by his work. The possibilities seemed endless. The investigation began with the people closest to Stephen Pitt. Detectives spoke with colleagues, friends, and professional contacts. They wanted to understand his daily routine. Did he have any recent conflicts? Had anyone threatened him? Had anyone shown unusual anger toward him? The answers were complicated. Because in a profession like Pitt's, disagreement was not unusual. His work required him to make judgments. And judgments, especially in criminal cases, often created strong reactions. But investigators soon noticed something important. There was no immediate evidence that Stephen Pitt had recently been involved in a direct conflict. There was no obvious enemy who had suddenly appeared. There was no clear warning that someone was preparing an attack. Instead, investigators were looking backward. They were searching through years of history. And somewhere in that history was the person who had decided Stephen Pitt needed to die. At the crime scene, detectives collected evidence that would later help connect the shooting to a larger pattern. Witness descriptions began forming the first picture of the attacker. People nearby remembered seeing a man who appeared calm and deliberate. This was not someone acting randomly. The attacker did not appear confused. He did not panic. He carried out the shooting and left. That detail would become significant. Investigators often study not only what a suspect does, but how they do it. The behavior before, during, and after a crime can reveal a person's mindset. A chaotic attack often suggests impulsive emotion. A controlled attack suggests planning. And everything about the shooting suggested preparation. Someone had made decisions before arriving. Someone had chosen a time. A location. A target. The investigation continued through the night. While detectives worked at the scene, another process began behind the scenes. Authorities started reviewing information about Stephen Pitt's professional life. They looked at the cases he had worked on. They examined people who had interacted with him over the years. They searched for anyone who might have carried a long-standing resentment. Because revenge crimes are often not born from one moment. They develop over time. A person may experience a painful event. They may blame someone else. They may replay the situation repeatedly in their mind. And eventually, the original event becomes something much larger than reality. For investigators, the possibility of revenge was becoming increasingly important. The question became, was Stephen Pitt killed because of something he had done recently? Or because of something someone believed he had done years earlier? That distinction would change everything. Then, less than a day after Pitt's murder, the investigation took a shocking turn. On June 1, 2018, police received reports of another shooting at a Scottsdale law office. At first, authorities did not know whether the incidents were connected. Another shooting could have been unrelated. Another tragedy. Another investigation. But as details emerged, the similarities became impossible to ignore. 2 women had been killed. Valeria Sharp and Laura Anderson. They were legal assistants working inside the office. They were not people who lived in the public eye. They were not involved in violent professions. They were employees simply doing their jobs. Yet somehow, they had become targets. The attack revealed a terrifying pattern. The victims were not chosen randomly. There was a connection between them and Stephen Pitt. They were connected through the legal world. Through the same painful chapter involving Dwight Lamont Jones. And suddenly, investigators understood they were not chasing a single murderer. They were chasing someone carrying out a revenge plan. The fear level changed instantly. A murderer who kills once may stop. A murderer who kills again is showing something much more dangerous. A willingness to continue. The community began asking questions. Who would be next? How many names were on the list? How long had this been planned? Police officers now faced a race against time. They needed to identify the suspect before another person became a victim. Investigators began following every possible lead. They examined surveillance footage. They tracked vehicle movements. They collected witness accounts. They analyzed phone records. Slowly, the name Dwight Lamont Jones began appearing. The connection was not random. It came from the past. Years earlier, Jones had been involved in a bitter divorce. During that period, Stephen Pitt had evaluated him. Legal professionals connected to the case had also become involved. According to investigators, Jones believed those people were responsible for the collapse of his life. The divorce was over. The court proceedings had ended. But emotionally, Jones appeared unable to move forward. Instead, the past remained alive. And investigators believed that resentment eventually transformed into a plan. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered information suggesting Jones had been preparing. This was not simply a person who suddenly lost control. The attacks appeared connected to a specific list of people he blamed. People he believed had taken something from him. His reputation. His family. His future. His sense of control. The tragedy was that those people were not enemies in reality. They were professionals performing their roles. But inside Jones's mind, they had become responsible for his suffering. The investigation now had a suspect. But finding him would be the next challenge. Because Dwight Jones was no longer simply a person connected to the case. He was a man believed to be armed, dangerous, and still capable of violence. And while police searched for him, more questions remained unanswered. How many victims were there? Where would he go next? And could investigators reach him before the revenge plan was complete? The murder of Stephen Pitt had started with a single attack outside an office. But the evidence was revealing something much darker. A carefully directed campaign of revenge. A campaign that had been building silently for years. And now, the investigators of Arizona were following a trail left behind by a man who believed he was delivering justice. A trail that would lead them directly into the mind of Dwight Lamont Jones. As the sun rose over Arizona in the days following Dr. Stephen Pitt's murder, the atmosphere across the region had changed. What began as a shocking killing outside a professional office had become something much larger. Police were no longer investigating a single homicide. They were trying to stop a person they believed was moving through the community with a specific purpose. A person who had already shown that he was willing to kill. And the most frightening part was that investigators still did not know whether the violence was finished. The name Dwight Lamont Jones slowly moved from the background of the investigation into the center of it. But finding a suspect's name is not the same as finding the suspect. Police needed evidence. They needed a timeline. They needed to understand his movements, his motives, and most importantly, his next possible target. Every hour mattered. Because investigators believed they were not chasing someone who had acted randomly. They were chasing someone who had spent years building resentment. Someone who had transformed personal pain into a mission. The investigation into Dwight Jones forced detectives to go back almost a decade. Back to 2009. Back to the beginning of the conflict that would eventually end with multiple people dead. At that time, Jones was not a household name. He was not known as a criminal. He was a businessman and a husband dealing with the collapse of his marriage. Like many divorces, the situation involved intense emotions, disagreements, and legal conflict. But according to investigators, Jones's situation became increasingly complicated. The divorce did not simply represent the end of a relationship. In his mind, it became a battle. A battle where he believed he had been treated unfairly. A battle where he believed others had taken control of his life. During that period, concerns were raised about his behavior. There were allegations of domestic violence. There were accusations of threats. There were signs that his anger toward the situation was becoming more intense. As part of the legal process, Stephen Pitt was brought in to evaluate Jones. The purpose of the evaluation was not personal. It was not meant to punish him. It was part of the legal system's attempt to understand the situation. Professionals often perform these evaluations in difficult family disputes when there are concerns about safety, mental health, or potential violence. Stephen Pitt approached the situation the same way he approached every other case. He examined the information available. He considered behavior patterns. He formed a professional opinion. But for Dwight Jones, that opinion would become something much more personal. Investigators later believed that Jones viewed Pitt's evaluation as a betrayal. Instead of seeing it as a professional assessment, he saw it as another attack against him. And over the years, that belief appeared to grow stronger. This became one of the most important psychological elements of the investigation. Because many revenge cases do not begin with a sudden decision. They begin with a story someone tells themselves repeatedly. A story where they are the victim. A story where someone else must be blamed. A story where revenge starts to feel justified. For years, Jones carried that story. The divorce ended. The legal process moved on. People involved returned to their normal lives. But investigators believed Jones remained emotionally trapped in that period. The anger survived. The resentment survived. And eventually, the people connected to that painful chapter became targets. As detectives examined Jones's background, they began looking for signs that the attacks were planned. They wanted to know when the idea of revenge began. They wanted to know when anger became intention. They wanted to know whether the shootings were spontaneous or carefully prepared. The evidence pointed toward preparation. The attacks were not committed against random strangers. The victims shared connections. They were people Jones associated with the legal conflict that had consumed years of his life. This was not chaos. It was a pattern. Stephen Pitt. The legal assistants. Other individuals connected to the case. One by one, the victims appeared to represent different parts of the same grievance. Investigators began constructing a picture of how Jones may have viewed the world. Not through objective reality, but through his own interpretation. In that version of events, he was not responsible for his problems. Someone else was. And those people needed to pay. This mindset is often seen in individuals who commit targeted acts of violence. They create a justification. They convince themselves that what they are doing is necessary. The violence becomes, in their mind, a form of correction or punishment. But outside that distorted viewpoint, the reality was devastating. The victims were people. People with families. People with friends. People who woke up each day without knowing they would become part of someone else's revenge plan. As police continued their investigation, they gathered more information linking Jones to the shootings. Technology played a major role. Surveillance cameras provided pieces of the timeline. Witnesses provided descriptions. Investigators tracked movements and searched for connections. Phone records helped create a clearer picture. The investigation became a race between evidence and time. Every piece of information brought them closer. But every delay created danger. Because Jones was still somewhere. And no one knew what he planned to do next. The community watched nervously as news reports spread. People who had never heard of Stephen Pitt before learned about his career. They learned about his connection to famous criminal cases. They learned about the victims who followed. And they learned that the suspected killer was not someone who had attacked without reason. He had a reason. A dangerous, personal reason. He believed he had been wronged. And he was willing to destroy lives because of that belief. As investigators searched for Jones, they also examined his personal history. They looked at his relationships. His behavior after the divorce. His interactions with people connected to the case. They tried to understand whether anyone had seen warning signs. Whether anyone had recognized how deep his anger had become. The difficult reality was that many people who knew Jones remembered him through ordinary moments. He was not someone who appeared to everyone as a threat. He had lived a normal life. He had worked. He had relationships. He had daily routines. But beneath that surface, investigators believed, there was a growing obsession. A person can carry anger quietly. They can appear calm while replaying old conflicts internally. They can move through ordinary days while becoming more focused on a single grievance. And when that grievance becomes the center of someone's identity, the consequences can be catastrophic. By this point, police had a clearer understanding of who they were searching for. Dwight Lamont Jones. A 56-year-old man believed to be responsible for a series of targeted killings. A man who investigators said had created his own list of people to blame. A man who had turned a painful chapter of his past into a deadly mission. But knowing his identity was only the beginning. The next challenge was locating him. Because somewhere in Arizona, Dwight Jones was still moving. And investigators knew one thing above all. A person who had already crossed the line into murder might not hesitate to cross it again. The search intensified. Officers followed every lead. Every possible location. Every piece of information. The clock continued to move forward. And the question that haunted everyone involved was simple. Could they find Dwight Jones before another name was added to his list? For investigators in Arizona, the days following the murder of Dr. Stephen Pitt became a race against time. The case had already transformed from a single homicide into something far more dangerous. A pattern had emerged. The victims were connected. The attacks appeared deliberate. And somewhere outside the view of law enforcement, the person responsible was still moving. Every investigator working the case understood one painful reality. The longer Dwight Lamont Jones remained free, the greater the chance that someone else could die. The investigation now depended on connecting fragments. A surveillance image. A witness memory. A vehicle description. A phone record. A detail that seemed insignificant at first, but could suddenly reveal the entire story. In major investigations, breakthroughs rarely arrive as one dramatic moment. More often, they come slowly. Piece by piece. Until the picture finally becomes impossible to ignore. And that was exactly what happened in the search for Dwight Jones. After the murder of Stephen Pitt, investigators immediately began examining the victim's background. They knew Pitt's career created many possible motives, but the second wave of killings changed the direction of the investigation. The connection between the victims pointed toward one specific chapter of Pitt's life. The divorce case involving Dwight Jones. Suddenly, the professional world surrounding Stephen Pitt became less important than the personal conflict from years earlier. Detectives began reconstructing Jones's history. They examined the years after his divorce. They reviewed previous incidents involving him. They looked at the people he had blamed. And they discovered a troubling pattern. Jones had not simply been angry about the past. He had continued carrying that anger for years. The divorce had ended legally. But emotionally, investigators believed, it had never ended for him. The people involved had moved forward. Jones had not. Instead, he appeared to have built a narrative where certain individuals were responsible for his suffering. Stephen Pitt was one of those individuals. The lawyers connected to the case were others. The legal assistants who worked around them became part of the same story. To investigators, this explained why the victims were chosen. They were not random. They were symbols. Symbols of a painful period Jones believed had destroyed his life. As police continued collecting evidence, they began focusing on Jones's movements around the time of the shootings. Surveillance footage became one of the most valuable tools. In modern investigations, cameras often capture what witnesses cannot. A person walking into a building. A vehicle leaving an area. A suspect appearing calm moments before a crime. Every frame can become a piece of a timeline. Investigators reviewed available footage and began tracking Jones's movements. They compared locations. They examined times. They searched for connections between him and the crime scenes. Slowly, the possibility that Jones was responsible became stronger. Then came additional evidence. Witness accounts helped create a description of the suspect. People who had been near the scenes remembered details about the attacker. They described someone who appeared controlled. Someone who was not acting out of panic. That detail mattered. Because it suggested the attacks were not sudden emotional explosions. They were planned. A person who acts impulsively often leaves behind chaos. A person who plans an attack often leaves behind something else. A trail. And investigators were following that trail. The more they learned, the clearer the motive became. This was revenge. Not revenge over something that happened yesterday. Not revenge over a recent argument. But revenge built over years. The investigation revealed the disturbing possibility that Jones had spent a long time preparing mentally for this moment. The victims were connected by a single idea inside his mind. They represented the people he believed had taken something from him. His life. His reputation. His future. His sense of control. This was the dangerous psychology of the case. Because Jones did not appear to see his actions as murder. According to investigators, he appeared to see them as punishment. A person consumed by resentment can eventually stop seeing others as human beings and start seeing them as obstacles. The victims become part of a story. A story where violence feels justified. But outside of that distorted thinking was the reality. People who had nothing to do with Jones's anger were dead. Families were grieving. A community was frightened. And police were trying to stop the next tragedy. As investigators built their case, another important discovery emerged. Jones had apparently prepared for the confrontation with the people he blamed. The attacks showed planning and intention. He knew where to find his targets. He knew how to approach them. He knew how to escape afterward. The shootings were not random acts of violence. They were targeted killings. And that understanding helped investigators predict what Jones might do next. They began searching for additional possible targets. They examined his relationships. They looked at anyone connected to the divorce proceedings. Anyone who might appear on a list of people Jones blamed. Because the terrifying possibility remained. The list might not be complete. The breakthrough in the case was not only identifying Dwight Jones as the suspect. It was understanding the reason behind the crimes. Once investigators understood the motive, the investigation became much more focused. They knew they were not searching for a person randomly attacking strangers. They were searching for someone following a personal mission. A man who believed he had been wronged. A man who had spent years holding onto anger. A man who had decided that forgiveness was impossible. As the evidence continued to accumulate, law enforcement began closing the distance. The combination of surveillance footage, witness information, vehicle evidence, and digital records created a path leading directly toward Jones. The suspect, who had tried to disappear, was leaving behind clues. Every movement. Every decision. Every action after the shootings created another piece of evidence. Investigators were no longer asking whether Dwight Jones was involved. They were working to find where he was. Because identifying the suspect was only half of the battle. Stopping him was the priority. The entire region remained on edge. People followed updates closely. They wanted answers. They wanted safety. They wanted to know whether the violence was finally over. But for investigators, the case was still active. The killer was still alive. The search continued. And the final confrontation was approaching. On June 4, 2018, only days after Stephen Pitt was killed, police would finally locate Dwight Jones. The investigation that began outside a quiet office building would end at a hotel, where officers would surround the man accused of causing a deadly wave of violence across Arizona. But before that final moment arrived, investigators had to confront one last uncertainty. Would Dwight Jones surrender? Or would he choose one final act of violence? The answer would come soon. And it would bring an end to one of Arizona's most disturbing revenge-driven killing sprees. For several days in early June 2018, Arizona lived under a cloud of fear. The name Dwight Lamont Jones had become associated with a series of violent attacks that seemed impossible to comprehend. What began with the murder of Dr. Stephen Pitt outside his office had grown into a desperate search for a man believed to be responsible for multiple deaths. For law enforcement, the mission was simple but urgent. Find Dwight Jones. Stop him. Prevent another victim. Behind every police briefing and every investigative update was the same concern, the possibility that the violence was not finished. A person who had already killed multiple times had shown that he was willing to continue. And investigators believed that Jones was not running away randomly. He was moving with purpose. He was a man who had spent years holding on to a grievance, and now that grievance had turned into a deadly campaign. The investigation had revealed the foundation of his anger. Nearly a decade earlier, Jones had gone through a painful divorce. During that legal battle, he became connected with several people who would later become his targets. Stephen Pitt, the forensic psychiatrist who evaluated him. The attorneys involved in the case. The legal assistants who worked in their offices. To the outside world, these were professionals doing their jobs. But according to investigators, Jones saw them differently. He believed they were responsible for the collapse of his life. And over the years, that belief became stronger. The tragedy was not only what Jones did. It was the path that led him there. A painful event from the past had become something he could not release. Instead of accepting the outcome, moving forward, and rebuilding his life, investigators believed Jones became increasingly focused on blame. The past became his present. The people connected to it became his enemies. And eventually, revenge became his goal. As police continued searching, they relied on every resource available. Investigators analyzed evidence collected from the crime scenes. They reviewed surveillance footage. They followed information from witnesses. They examined digital records. Each piece helped create a clearer picture of Jones's movements after the shootings. The suspect, who had appeared to carefully plan his attacks, had still left behind traces. No matter how carefully someone plans, every action creates evidence. A phone call. A location. A vehicle. A moment captured by a camera. A person who remembers seeing something unusual. The investigation became a race between Jones and the authorities. Every hour that passed increased the pressure. For the families of the victims, those hours were filled with pain and uncertainty. They were not only grieving. They were also living with the fear that the person responsible was still free. The victims were no longer just names in an investigation. They were people who had lives interrupted. People who had families waiting for them. People who had walked into ordinary days without knowing they would never return home. Stephen Pitt had spent his career helping others understand violence. He had studied dangerous behavior. He had helped courts and investigators analyze people accused of terrible crimes. But he could never have imagined becoming the victim of a targeted revenge attack. The irony was painful. A man who spent his life searching for explanations had become part of a mystery others were now trying to solve. As investigators followed the evidence, they eventually located Jones. The search led authorities to a hotel in the Phoenix area. By June 4, officers had gathered enough information to believe they knew where he was. The situation became a tactical operation. Police surrounded the location. The goal was clear. Take Jones into custody alive. Every arrest involving an armed suspect carries uncertainty. But this situation was different. This was a man suspected of killing multiple people. A man who had already demonstrated the ability to carry out planned attacks. Officers had to assume he was dangerous. They had to prepare for every possibility. Inside that hotel room was the person investigators believed had caused days of fear across Arizona. The man accused of killing Stephen Pitt. The man accused of killing Valeria Sharp and Laura Anderson. The man believed responsible for the deaths of additional victims connected to his revenge plan. The confrontation that followed would determine how the case ended. Would Dwight Jones come out peacefully? Would he answer for what he had done? Would the victims' families ever hear his explanation? For a brief moment, authorities attempted to resolve the situation without further bloodshed. But before officers could take him into custody, Jones made his final decision. He turned the weapon on himself. Dwight Lamont Jones died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The manhunt was over. But the questions remained. For law enforcement, there would be no trial. No courtroom testimony. No cross-examination. No opportunity to hear Jones explain his actions. The justice system would never have the chance to determine his guilt through a public trial. Instead, investigators were left to reconstruct the truth through evidence. They were left to study the timeline, the motives, the connections, the victims. The end of Jones's life closed the criminal case, but it did not erase the damage. 6 people were dead. Families were devastated. A community had experienced a terrifying reminder of how quickly personal resentment can transform into violence. The investigation revealed that this tragedy was not caused by a sudden argument or a moment of uncontrolled anger. It was something much more disturbing. A long-building obsession. A belief that grew stronger over time. A person who convinced himself that revenge was the only solution. The story of Dwight Jones became another example of a dangerous psychological pattern seen in many targeted attacks. The attacker often creates a personal explanation for their suffering. They identify people they believe are responsible. They repeat those beliefs until they become central to their identity. Eventually, the imagined injustice becomes more important than reality. And when that happens, the consequences can be catastrophic. But while investigators studied the mind of the killer, the families of the victims faced a different reality. They were left with empty chairs. Unanswered questions. Memories of people who would never come home. For them, the end of the manhunt did not feel like a victory. There was no courtroom moment. No sentence. No final statement from a judge. There was only loss. The death of Dwight Jones ended the immediate danger, but it did not end the story. Because the story was never only about the person who committed the crimes. It was also about the people whose lives were taken. The professionals who were targeted. The families who were changed forever. And the warning signs that appeared long before the violence began. The case of Stephen Pitt and Dwight Jones remains a disturbing reminder that some of the most dangerous conflicts are not always visible from the outside. Sometimes they grow quietly. Behind ordinary days. Behind closed doors. Inside the mind of someone who refuses to let go. And by the time the world sees the danger, the damage has already begun. When the final moments of the search for Dwight Lamont Jones ended inside that Arizona hotel room, the immediate fear was gone. The suspect was dead. The manhunt was over. The streets no longer carried the same uncertainty that had gripped the community for days. But for the families of the victims, there was no sense of closure. There was only absence. Because while investigators could close the search for a killer, the people who lost loved ones were left facing a reality that would never change. Stephen Pitt was gone. Valeria Sharp was gone. Laura Anderson was gone. And the other victims connected to the shooting spree were gone as well. The end of the investigation did not bring them back. It did not erase the pain. It did not answer every question. It simply marked the moment when the world began trying to understand what had happened. The story of Stephen Pitt's death was shocking because of who he was. A forensic psychiatrist. A respected professional. A man who had dedicated his life to studying violence. But the tragedy was much bigger than the murder of a famous expert. At the center of the case were ordinary human lives. People who had families. People who had routines. People who woke up on those final days believing they would return home. The victims were not characters in a criminal investigation. They were real people whose lives mattered beyond the headlines. For the family and friends of Stephen Pitt, the loss was impossible to comprehend. Those who knew him remembered a person who had spent decades helping others. He had worked with some of the most difficult cases in the country. He had studied people responsible for terrible acts. But those who knew him understood that his work did not make him cold or distant. His career was built on understanding. He believed that studying human behavior could help society recognize danger and prevent future tragedies. He spent his professional life asking difficult questions about violence. But no one expected that violence would eventually take him away. The circumstances of his death created a painful contradiction. The expert who analyzed the minds of dangerous individuals became a victim of one. The person who helped explain criminal behavior became the subject of a criminal investigation. For many colleagues in the fields of psychiatry, law enforcement, and criminal justice, his death represented something deeply unsettling. Professionals who work with dangerous individuals understand that their jobs carry risks. They know that their opinions may anger people. They know that some individuals may disagree with their conclusions. But there is still a natural belief that professional responsibility and personal safety can exist together. The murder of Stephen Pitt challenged that belief. It reminded many people that those who work closest to violence can sometimes become targets themselves. The deaths of Valeria Sharp and Laura Anderson brought another layer of tragedy. Unlike Stephen Pitt, they were not public figures. They were not known nationally. They were not people whose names appeared in famous investigations. They were employees simply doing their jobs. Their connection to the case came from their workplace and their association with the legal professionals involved in Jones's past. But to their families, they were not legal assistants. They were daughters, friends, loved ones. Their lives contained memories that had nothing to do with the crime that ended them. A favorite conversation. A personal joke. A family tradition. Small moments that suddenly became precious after they were gone. That is one of the hardest realities of violent crime. The world often remembers victims through the final moments of their lives. But their families remember everything before that. They remember who they were before tragedy. They remember the years that came before the headlines. They remember the person, not the crime scene. As investigators continued examining the case, one of the biggest questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented? That question is common after targeted violence. People search for warning signs. They look backward through events. They ask whether someone noticed something. Whether something could have been done differently. In the case of Dwight Jones, investigators discovered a history of anger and conflict. There had been concerns about his behavior years earlier. There had been moments where professionals recognized potential risks. But understanding danger after a tragedy is easier than recognizing it before. Human behavior is complicated. Many people experience anger, frustration, and disappointment without ever becoming violent. The challenge for professionals is identifying when ordinary conflict crosses into something more dangerous. When resentment becomes obsession. When anger becomes a plan. When someone stops seeing others as people and starts seeing them as enemies. The case also raised concerns among legal and mental health professionals. Those who work in forensic fields often interact with individuals during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Divorce. Criminal charges. Family conflicts. Psychological evaluations. These situations can create intense emotions. Most people leave those experiences frustrated but eventually move forward. But a small number of individuals may become consumed by perceived injustice. They may refuse to accept responsibility. They may search for someone to blame. And when that mindset grows unchecked, the consequences can become devastating. The Arizona shootings became a reminder that revenge rarely begins with violence. It often begins with a thought, a belief, a memory that is repeated so many times that it becomes more powerful than reality. For Dwight Jones, investigators believed the divorce and the people connected to it became the center of his identity. Instead of seeing the past as something painful, but finished, he appeared to view it as an ongoing battle. And eventually, he acted on that belief. The tragedy was that the people he targeted were not responsible for the suffering he felt. They became victims of a story created inside his own mind. A story where revenge replaced acceptance. Where anger replaced healing. Where punishment replaced reality. The aftermath of the case also left questions about justice. Because Dwight Jones died before he could face a courtroom. There was no trial. No jury. No sentence. For some families, this created a complicated emotional reality. The person responsible was gone, but the process of healing was only beginning. A trial can sometimes provide answers. It can allow families to speak publicly. It can create a final moment where responsibility is acknowledged. In this case, that moment never came. The evidence told investigators what happened. But the victims' families would never hear Jones explain why. They would never know exactly what thoughts filled his mind during those final days. They would never hear an apology. They would never receive the answers that only he could provide. And perhaps that was one of the most painful parts of the tragedy. The man who created so much suffering took his own secrets with him, leaving behind a community to search for meaning in an act that seemed impossible to understand. Today, the case of Stephen Pitt and the Dwight Jones shootings remains a powerful reminder of the complexity of human behavior. It is a story about violence. But it is also a story about responsibility. About the danger of unchecked resentment. About the importance of recognizing warning signs. And most importantly, it is a story about the people who were lost. Because behind every investigation, every police report, and every headline are lives that existed long before tragedy found them. Stephen Pitt's legacy was not defined by the person who killed him. It was defined by the decades he spent helping others understand the darkest parts of humanity. The victims' lives were not defined by how they died. They were defined by how they lived. And that is the part of the story that remains long after the investigation ends. Long before the gunshots outside Dr. Stephen Pitt's office echoed through Arizona, long before investigators began searching for Dwight Lamont Jones, and long before a community learned the names of the victims, there was a story unfolding quietly. It was not a story written with weapons or crime scenes. It was a story written through emotions. Anger. Humiliation. Resentment. And a belief that someone else was responsible for every painful moment in one man's life. The investigation into the 2018 Arizona shootings revealed that the violence did not begin on the day Stephen Pitt was killed. The violence began years earlier, inside a conflict that continued long after the courtroom doors had closed. To understand what happened, investigators had to look beyond the shootings. They had to look at the years of frustration that came before them. They had to examine how a personal dispute transformed into an obsession. Because targeted violence rarely appears from nowhere. There is usually a pathway. A progression of thoughts and behaviors. A gradual movement from disappointment to anger, from anger to blame, and from blame to the belief that revenge is justified. According to investigators, Dwight Jones followed that path. The beginning of the story was his divorce. Like many relationship breakdowns, the end of the marriage involved emotional pain and conflict. Divorce can bring out intense feelings. People may experience sadness, fear, uncertainty, or a sense of failure. For most individuals, those emotions eventually fade. They rebuild. They adapt. They create a new chapter. But investigators believed Jones experienced something different. Instead of accepting the end of the relationship, he appeared to become increasingly focused on the idea that he had been wronged. The legal process became, in his mind, not just a difficult experience, but a personal attack. The people involved were no longer professionals performing their roles. They became enemies. This was the beginning of what investigators later described as a long-standing grievance. A grievance is more than simple anger. Anger can disappear. A grievance is different. It is a story someone repeats to themselves. A story about what was taken from them. A story about who caused their suffering. A story where the person carrying the anger becomes convinced that they have been treated unfairly. Over time, that story can become stronger than reality. Every memory becomes evidence. Every disagreement becomes proof. Every setback becomes another reason to blame someone else. For Dwight Jones, investigators believed that the people connected to his divorce became symbols of everything he believed had gone wrong. Stephen Pitt became one of those symbols. But the reality was very different. Pitt was not a personal enemy. He was a professional. He was asked to perform an evaluation, and he provided an opinion based on his expertise. That was the purpose of his role. But in Jones's mind, investigators believed, the evaluation represented something much larger. It represented rejection. It represented judgment. It represented a moment when he felt powerless. And for someone already struggling with anger, that feeling can become extremely dangerous. The human mind has a powerful ability to protect itself. When people experience painful situations, they often search for explanations. Sometimes they look inward. They ask, what could I have done differently? What choices led me here? How can I move forward? But sometimes people look outward. They search for someone to blame. And once blame becomes the foundation of a person's thinking, forgiveness becomes almost impossible. The past stops being a memory. It becomes an ongoing conflict. Years passed after the divorce. The people involved continued their lives. Stephen Pitt continued his work. The attorneys moved forward. The legal assistants built their careers. But investigators believed Jones continued carrying the emotional weight of that period. The passage of time did not reduce the anger. It strengthened it. This is what made the case so disturbing. The shootings were not the result of one bad day. They were the result of years of unresolved resentment. By the time violence occurred, the victims were not simply people. They had become targets in a personal narrative. A narrative where Jones believed he was correcting an injustice. This kind of thinking is one of the most dangerous aspects of revenge-driven violence. The attacker often does not see themselves as the villain. They see themselves as someone who has been pushed too far. They believe their actions are understandable. Sometimes even necessary. But from the outside, the reality is clear. The person who claims to be seeking justice becomes the person causing the greatest injustice. The victims become innocent people caught inside someone else's distorted belief system. In the days after the shootings, investigators examined whether there were warning signs that could have predicted what happened. They looked at Jones's history, his previous behavior, his statements, his conflicts. They tried to understand whether anyone could have recognized the danger earlier. This is one of the most difficult questions after any act of targeted violence. People naturally want a clear answer. They want to believe there was one obvious moment when everything could have changed. But reality is rarely that simple. Human behavior exists on a complicated spectrum. Many people experience anger. Many people feel betrayed. Many people go through painful losses. Most never become violent. The challenge is identifying when anger transforms into something more dangerous. When someone stops looking for solutions and begins looking for punishment. When someone stops wanting closure and starts wanting revenge. Investigators believed Dwight Jones crossed that line. The evidence suggested he had moved beyond frustration. He had created a plan. He had chosen targets. He had decided that killing was an acceptable response to his feelings. The victims became casualties of that decision. The case also raised broader concerns among professionals who work within the legal and mental health systems. Forensic psychiatrists, attorneys, and court professionals often interact with people during moments of extreme emotional pressure. They make decisions. They provide evaluations. They give opinions. Their work is necessary for justice to function. But sometimes, those decisions are not accepted. Sometimes, people who receive unfavorable outcomes search for someone to blame. And sometimes, that blame can become dangerous. Stephen Pitt understood the risks of human behavior better than most people. His career was built on recognizing patterns. But even someone who studies violence cannot predict every act. Even experts cannot see inside every person's mind. The tragedy of this case was that the warning signs were not visible as a complete picture until after the violence occurred. Only afterward did investigators see how the pieces connected. The anger. The resentment. The fixation on the past. The belief that certain people were responsible. The decision to seek revenge. Each piece alone may not have revealed the final outcome. But together, they created a disturbing image. A man who could not let go. A man who allowed an old conflict to define his entire future. And eventually, a man who decided that other people should die because he believed they had caused his pain. The story of Dwight Jones is not only about what happened in 2018. It is also about what happened in the years before. The invisible moments. The private thoughts. The anger that grew quietly. Because the most frightening part of this case was not just the violence itself. It was the realization that the violence had been developing long before anyone heard the first gunshot. And when the world finally saw it, it was already too late. In the days after the shootings, investigators faced a difficult task. They knew who they were looking for. They knew why he was believed to have acted. But understanding the mind of a suspect was only one part of solving a case. They needed to prove the timeline. They needed to reconstruct every movement. Every decision. Every moment that led from resentment to murder. The investigation into Dwight Lamont Jones became a complex puzzle built from thousands of small details. No single piece explained everything. But together, those pieces revealed a frightening picture. A man who had spent years holding on to anger had finally acted on it. And after he began, he did not stop. The first challenge for investigators was connecting the attacks. At the beginning, each crime scene represented a separate tragedy. The murder of Stephen Pitt. The shooting at the Scottsdale Law Office. The additional killings that followed. Each location had its own evidence, its own witnesses, its own timeline. But detectives quickly recognized a common thread. The victims were not selected randomly. They were connected by a shared history. That discovery changed the entire direction of the investigation. This was not a person attacking strangers. This was a person following a specific purpose. The victims represented people Dwight Jones believed were connected to the collapse of his life years earlier. Once investigators understood that, the search became more focused. They no longer needed to examine every possible person who might have wanted revenge against Stephen Pitt. They needed to examine the people who had a personal connection to that old legal conflict. And one name continued to rise above the others. Dwight Lamond Jones. The evidence against him continued to grow. Investigators looked at his movements before and after the shootings. They analyzed information from cameras in the area. They followed leads from witnesses. They examined records that helped create a timeline. Each piece helped answer one important question. Was Dwight Jones simply connected to these events? Or was he responsible for them? The more investigators uncovered, the stronger the connection became. The shootings appeared too organized to be accidental. The victims appeared too connected to be coincidence. And the motive appeared too personal to ignore. The investigation also revealed something important about the nature of revenge crimes. The victims were chosen because of what they represented to the suspect. Not necessarily because of who they truly were. This distinction is critical. In the real world, people are complex. They have different roles in different situations. A doctor can be a professional, a colleague, a friend, and a family member. A legal assistant can simply be someone earning a living. But inside the mind of someone consumed by resentment, those identities can disappear. A person becomes a symbol, an enemy, a reminder of pain. And once someone is reduced to a symbol, it becomes easier for the attacker to justify violence. This was one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The victims were not attacked because of who they were as people. They were attacked because of a story created inside another person's mind. As detectives continued their work, they also examined Jones's behavior after the shootings. His actions suggested planning. He did not simply disappear without direction. He attempted to avoid capture. He moved through locations. He stayed ahead of investigators for several days. But every step he took created more evidence. Modern investigations are built on connections. A person may believe they are escaping. But technology often tells another story. A camera records movement. A phone leaves digital information. A witness remembers a detail. A vehicle appears in the wrong place at the wrong time. Slowly, the path becomes visible. The same careful planning that allowed a suspect to carry out a crime can also become the evidence that leads investigators to them. For the families of the victims, the investigation brought a mixture of emotions. They wanted answers. They wanted the person responsible found. But they were also forced to face a painful reality. The person they believed caused their suffering was still out there. Every day without an arrest created more uncertainty. Every new report created more fear. The community watched as police searched for Jones. People wondered where he was. They wondered whether another attack could happen. They wondered whether someone else was on his list. That fear was one of the most difficult parts of the investigation. Because in many crimes, the danger ends when the attacker leaves the scene. But in a revenge-driven killing spree, the danger continues until the person is found. Investigators knew they had to move quickly. The case was no longer only about justice. It was about prevention. It was about protecting anyone else who might become a target. As they reconstructed the events, detectives gained a clearer understanding of Jones's motivation. The violence was not about money. It was not about robbery. It was not about opportunity. It was about control. According to investigators, Jones believed that certain people had taken control of his life years earlier. Through violence, he attempted to regain power over a story where he felt powerless. But the result was the opposite. Instead of repairing his life, he destroyed countless others. He transformed his own pain into the pain of innocent families. He turned a personal grievance into a public tragedy. The investigation also highlighted an uncomfortable reality about targeted violence. Many attackers do not see themselves as dangerous. They often believe they are responding to an injustice. They create a justification that allows them to ignore the suffering they cause. This does not excuse their actions. It explains the psychological process that can lead someone to commit them. Understanding that process is important because prevention depends on recognizing dangerous patterns before they become irreversible. In the case of Dwight Jones, investigators believed those patterns had existed for years. The inability to move beyond the divorce. The focus on blame. The belief that others were responsible for his suffering. The transformation of frustration into obsession. All of these elements created the path toward violence. By early June, investigators had gathered enough information to locate Jones. The search that began with a single murder had become a statewide effort. The evidence had led them from a crime scene outside Stephen Pitt's office to the person believed responsible. The final stage of the investigation was approaching. The authorities knew where Dwight Jones was. Now they had to decide how to bring him into custody. The goal was clear. End the threat. Protect the public. Bring the investigation to a conclusion. But there was still one unknown. How would Dwight Jones react when he realized the search was over? Would he surrender? Would he finally answer for what he had done? Or would he choose one final act of violence? The answer would come soon. And when it did, it would leave behind a case filled with unanswered questions. Because investigators could reconstruct the actions. They could follow the evidence. They could explain the timeline. But one thing remained impossible to fully understand. How a man could carry anger for so long that he eventually decided other human beings had to die.